Imagine getting up each morning overtaxed, overworked, bereft of all your basic rights, while a handful of powerful elites are into grand lifestyles. What would it take for you to finally say, enough is enough? Today, we plunge into one of the most explosive chapters in history, peasant revolts, time when the oppressed rose en masse against their oppressors. But the real question is, what did it take for ordinary men and women to risk everything to revolt against poverty, hunger, and injustice? Stick around because, by the end of this video, you'll understand not just why they revolted, but feel the weight of their courage. We will also touch on how such uprisings left their mark in history and shaped the world in ways most couldn't imagine. And honestly speaking, it hits closer to home than you may imagine. Understanding why peasants rebelled involves going back to look at what finally pushed them over the edge. In medieval Europe, peasants were the backbone of society. They tilled the land, fed the people, and kept the economy running. Still, they did not have anything in their name. Everything belonged to the lords, right from the land on which they toiled down to the fruits of their labor, through a system referred to as feudalism. Can you imagine going to work daily and owning nothing, not even the ground you walk on? And the taxes continued to go up. On top of that, the lords were asking for a lot more work than before. What was the straw that broke the camel's back? The Black Death came along. The plague wiped out close to half of Europe's population, bringing in an enormous shortage of labor. For the very first time, peasants felt their worth. They started asking for better wages and working conditions. Instead, they found inflexible laws answering them, calculated to keep them in subjection, besides heavy taxes imposed and the enforcement of military service. This was the last straw, because shortly afterwards, the tension came to a head, and then Europe-wide uprisings by peasants began. One of the most famous was the English Peasants Revolt of 1381, in which thousands of peasants, led by figures such as Wat Tyler and the preacher John Ball, marched on London. The demands were basic: an end to serfdom in return for better wages and lower taxes. The rallying cry, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? What a real reminder from them that all people are equal in God's eyes. For a moment it seemed like the peasants won. They stormed the Tower of London, executed corrupt officials, and even confronted the young King Richard II. But all of that pretty quickly turned sour. The king promised reform, then broke those promises the minute the revolt was suppressed. Wat Tyler was killed, and the rest of the rebels hunted down. Across the Channel, France had its uprising, Jacquerie, also in 1358. Loaded down with taxes to finance endless wars, French peasants erupted in violence. As with the case in England, however, the nobility struck back with brutal force, and the rebellion met its end in a bloody massacre. It also spared Germany. The German Peasants War of 1524–1525, an affair inspired by the Protestant Reformation, saw peasants surge in a sea of demands for social and economic reforms. Divine in justification, the revolt ended in disaster, considering the tens of thousands of peasants that noble armies slaughtered after some early successes. These were put down with utmost violence. However, the memory of them lived on. These uprising events were clear omens that the feudal system started to crack. Even the most powerless people began to challenge the status quo. Yet the system did not collapse overnight, but these revolts planted the seeds of change. As uprisings sprouted throughout Europe, it became crystal clear that the old ways of oppression could not stand. Feudalism began to break down slowly, and peasants gradually started acquiring their rights. The rebellions made the ruling classes understand that people could not stand being treated as property forever. Even though the peasants' revolts were defeated in the end, their courage has inspired innumerable movements for justice and equality throughout history. It is not an uprising over trifles, but also a struggle against humiliation. The courage of the people who had nothing yet were ready to risk all that nothing speaks to us today. It reminds us that history is shaped by those brave enough to stand up, no matter the odds. The peasant revolts remind us that the march to equity, equality, and justice is never easy. It might be the kings and the nobles who write history, but it is through the commoner, that man or woman who refuses to be silenced, that history truly comes into being. These revolutions may not have been immediately successful, but their reverberations still hang in the air today. What does that mean to us? Every time we are faced with injustice, every time the world seems unfair, we can always refer to those who came before us. Their fight was never just about them. It was always about posterity. We remember struggles, not to say the power of standing up for what is right is in our hands, but every act of courage is a part of a greater story of progress. The most important thing history can teach us is that even change that feels insurmountable is possible. So if this video has inspired you, be sure to hit that like, subscribe, and share with someone in need of being reminded just how incredible the human spirit is.